There's nothing holy about politics. Think about it. Most of us don't trust politicians. Most of us don't trust our government, the whole system around it. But how do we respond in a holy way to our government, to our political sphere? Let's check it out. But hey, we are glad you're here. And next week, does anyone know what's happening? That right there, your mom is loving you right now. Mother's Day, exactly. So if you haven't got your mom something nice, or your spouse, if your kids are too young, my kids are 6, 5, and 1. I tried to say, hey, next week I'm gonna be gone, getting ready for church. If you can do breakfast in bed, that'd be great. The only one that said they could do it is my 1-year-old. He said, yep. And I'm like, perfect, it's done. But it is Mother's Day, and hey, this is an awesome opportunity that bring your mom to church, or if you are a mom, guilt trip your kids into coming to church with you. Come celebrate as we celebrate the moms in our life. We're doing child dedications, and you might see some pictures go behind me of last year when we had this. It's just a great Sunday where we get to just celebrate all the things our moms do in our life, but then also get to celebrate our God and all that he does for us as well. But today we are continuing on in our series, Touching Holiness. And if you've been with us, we've been studying through the book of 1 Peter, and we're going to be in 1 Peter and 2 Peter as we go through this series. And all this, as indicated by the title, is how we can pursue the holiness of God more. How can we attempt to touch it and understand it? And today when we come to our passage, we come to the topic of government and politics. And as I'm studying this and I'm literally writing holiness and politics, I'm like, that should not be in the same sentence. Unless the sentence is, there is nothing holy about politics, right? Or like holy something, this guy is awful, or girl, or something like, yeah. Get that one? Think about that a little longer. But holy in politics is like oil and water. Like when we think of politicians, when we think of the structure of politics, all we think of is swindlers. We think of dishonesty. We think of how corrupt everything is. And then when we think of our actions towards them, I don't know about you, but when you see things about politics on social media or on the news, the first thing in you is like, I'm gonna act righteously in response to that. Now, usually you get angry, you get mad, you get frustrated, you start wondering what the heck is wrong with our world. But today we're gonna see how do these two intersect. And this is our key thought we're gonna start with today that our passage is gonna kind of bring out of us, is that as Christians, as those who follow God, as those who say, yes, Jesus is my Savior, that we are citizens of heaven. We've already talked about this a little bit through 1 Peter, that our citizenship is not in earth, it's not even in America. Ultimately, it is in something greater, of our God in heaven. And as Christians, we are citizens of heaven. And here's the hard part of this, is our special citizenship holds us to a higher law. You're like, maybe I'm not good at keeping the current law. I know when I get behind a wheel of a car, I am not. I was having a discussion during our garden day yesterday with John, actually, and he said his insurance company has put something in his car that monitors how good of a driver he is and gives him a discount. I say I will never put one of those in my car, okay? Because how can you not speed in Phoenix? Anyway, I'm sorry. But as Christians, this is tough. We are called to a higher standard. We are called to something greater in how we interact with politics and our society at large. A couple weeks ago, when we had our last pizza with the pastor, in that we talk about our church and we do some discussion stuff around our tables, kind of like we do in our Bible groups. And a discussion kind of broke out about how someone admitted how they get angry in certain situations. And then we all started talking about it. And it's funny, we're like, it's easy to be mad and angry and act like you shouldn't if you're a follower of Christ, when you don't think anyone around you knows they can see you. Right? When you're on the road and you're like, none of these cars know who I am. Or when you're in the store and you're like, none of these employees know me. Or when you're commenting on social media under some burner account, you're like, nobody knows this is me, right? Then you can be a little angrier and you can be mean, and it's kind of challenging to maybe act like we should. And it's like, when I don't think I'll ever see these people again, maybe if I lose my temper, it's okay because my family didn't see it. My church didn't see it. My close friends didn't see it. But God still did. And one of the things that we're going to see today is one of the hardest things to do is how do we interact And how do we act holy and righteous in our culture at large, in society at large, even when we're anonymous, even when we're out there, even though when maybe the people that see us, it's not gonna have consequences. Answering really this question is, how do we pursue holiness, and how does pursuing holiness impact how we should interact with people in politics? If you have your Bible, go ahead and flip to 1 Peter chapter 1. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, and we're gonna be starting in verse 11. In 1 Peter 2:11, and if you've been with us so far, you've maybe heard of this, but let me give a little recap of kind of what we've covered in this letter that Peter has written so far. He starts this letter, and he's writing this kind of to people across the Roman Empire. He's writing it to Jewish Christians specifically, and he starts it out and reminds them that, hey, Jesus is alive. That Jesus is not dead, that many have heard of him dying on a cross, that it was common knowledge at the time, but he's like, hey, remember, he also rose again. And because Jesus raised from the grave, that we are called to live different lives that are more holy, lives that are set apart, lives that sometimes are really difficult. And he uses this phrase that we are to grow into our salvation. That Jesus saved us for our former life. Now we got to live aspiring towards this greater life through the power of God. And we do this in a few ways. A couple weeks ago, we said we do this by balancing these things called truth and love from God's word. That what is the truth that God tells us that is revealed to by the Bible, and how do we love like Jesus loved people? And last week we said, hey, this is really hard, but we get to do it within the context, within the identity of God's people as his church. That when we gather together, that we get to encourage one another. When we gather together, we get to be one with another, and we're no longer defined by our past, but we're defined as people of God. Well, today, Peter enters into a section that is really difficult. And he almost kind of breaks this into three places and kind of talks about how do we have holy living in society at large in our politics? How do we have holy living in our workplace? Well, that's going to be a rough one. And how do we have holy lives in our marriages? I think that one's even worse. Okay, that one might be the hardest. But today, as we enter into this idea in this arena of kind of our at-large society and politics, and when we talk about pursuing holiness in this manner, the first thing we're going to see of how this impacts how we respond is that it should cause us to remember that we are merely strangers among God's enemies. 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 11, here's what Peter starts writing. He says, "Dear friends, I urge you as strangers and exiles to abstain from sinful desires that wage war against the soul. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that when they slander you as evildoers, they will observe your good works and they will glorify God on the day he visits." As Peter begins this section, there's a few kind of key words and identifiers that he uses that I think take some time that we need to break down and talk about a little bit. First, he starts this section, he says, "Dear friends." Probably a better translation of that would be "dear beloved." Now, if you kind of break that down a little bit more, it's like, what does that word beloved mean? And maybe you've gone to a church before where they've said, hey, like, good morning, beloved, right? None of you? Okay. I don't think I can pull that off. I'm not a beloved guy. I'm more of like a, hey, what's up, bro? Instead of, hey, my beloved bro. I don't know how it works. But this word beloved had some weight to it. A couple of the ways is, first, when he says this word beloved or friends, he's referring to the people standing in the presence of God. That's literally how you can translate that word. Last week, we talked about how the church is identified as people coming together. And one of the things he says is, as the church, you are a spiritual house. Meaning when we all leave today and go eat lunch or go on our lives and this building is empty, it is no longer a church by spiritual definitions. It's just an empty brick building. But when the people come into this, it becomes a spiritual house. It becomes a church. So when he's saying, dear beloved, he's like, hey, you people who are standing in the presence of God because you are followers of Jesus and you are gathered together. But then he also says to the beloved, which is my friends, to those he had relationships with, to those the writer Peter loved and knew and saw their faces as God is dictating how he writes this. it made me kind of reflect and think about this a little bit in my week, is that as I prepare sermons, one of the things that I think about as I'm writing, or I don't write words because my handwriting's terrible, typing, okay, writing in that way, but I start picturing faces. And I start picturing the faces of you, especially the ones that fall asleep, okay? I'm just kidding. I'm like, hey, how am I going to make Bob not fall asleep this week? I'm just kidding. We don't actually have a Bob here. That's a hypothetical Bob. But if you fall asleep, I do see it. So I'm just going to throw that out there, right? But I see faces in more actually legitimate ways. And I see the faces of the people I love. I see the faces of the people that I care about, of the people that are my friends, of the people that are close in my life. And as I write words for a sermon, I think about the audience that it is going out to. And Peter, as he's writing this to people who he has relationships with, who he knows, and he's writing from a place of care and love in his life. But then he continues. And there's a couple more words that he uses here that are interesting and we need to talk about. First he says that I urge you, and he identifies his friends as strangers and exiles. And then he comes to another person and audience in here, is then he also says that live among the Gentiles. Now let's break those words down for a second, because this word of strangers and exile, that can be geographic, and that can be kind of an ethnic word as could be used in this day. For example, before Peter wrote this, and he's writing this a little bit after, there's this event by the Roman emperor at the time, Nero, called the diaspora. Is he didn't like Christians, he didn't like Jews, so he kind of persecuted them really hard in Jerusalem. So in order to live and kind of flee for their lives, they literally just ran out all over Rome. They were dispersed. And so they're living all over the known world at the time. So literally they are exiles where they're at. And then let's go to this next word. He also uses this word Gentile. And Gentile here could also mean literally someone that is just not Jewish ethnically. It's used throughout the Old Testament to refer to those who are not God's people, who are not Jewish, but someone else. But Peter here, he isn't using these words kind of in an ethnic or a geographical fashion. He's using them in a spiritual sense. When he says, hey, strangers and exiles, he's saying, hey, you are strangers and exiles to this world. If you were here in the first song, we sang a song called Bound for Glory. And in the first line of that song, it says, this world is not my home. And Peter is reminding them, he's like, hey, I know this world is really jacked up, but let me remind you, it's not your ultimate home. That you're merely passing by here. You are a stranger to this place. You are an exile in this area. And he's like, hey, you eventually are going to go to a new heaven, a new earth that God is preparing you for all of eternity. But then he uses this word Gentile. And Gentile, again here, he's using in a spiritual sense. And this would be translated more as someone who was a pagan, or anyone who was at odds or was an enemy of God the Father, or an enemy of Yahweh as we know him throughout the Old Testament. So when Peter is writing this is what he's saying. He's like, hey, I know it's hard that you are strangers among God's enemies. But he says this, instead of fighting those who are enemies of God, I'm going to tell you a few things to worry about with yourself. And that's where he goes into this, continues in this verse, and he tells us instead of fighting with those around us, that we are to focus on our conduct. He tells us this in two ways. First, he tells us to abstain from sinful desires that wage war against our soul. Here's the trap we can so often fall into as Christians and as the church, is we come to church, we start to learn more about God, we start to learn about the standards that God has set, and we start to kind of bring those in, and we're like, yeah, I agree with those. Yeah, I want to strive to be like that. And then we look at our culture, and in our natural flesh, the first thing we want to do is we want to judge them. We're like, man, our world is messed up. Man, my neighbor, he's messed up. Man, this person, like, I'm going to start judging everyone around me. And Peter's like, hey, worry about your own junk first. It's like the story of the woman caught in adultery. The religious leaders of the day caught a woman in the act of adultery. Don't know how that happened. Kind of sounds like a setup. They bring her. They don't bring the dude. I don't know what's up with that. Again, their motives weren't very pure. They throw him in front of Jesus, trying to trap Jesus, and they literally have their stones in their hand and say, hey, the law says we are to stone her to death. What say you? And Jesus starts scribbling in the sand, and finally he says, hey, he who is without sin casts the first stone. And starting with the oldest and wisest men to the youngest, they all drop their stone and they go away. And Peter's telling us the same kind of idea. He's saying, hey, before you judge how terrible the world around you is, before you judge all your politicians that deserve the judgment, look at yourself first. Abstain from the sinful desires that wage war in your own soul. And then he goes on, he says, then conduct honorably good works. So he kind of one-ups this. He says, not just stop doing bad things, but instead do great things. We've used this example before in our church and kind of talked about this concept of what we strive to be here at Cross Church. But we have, you'll hear this phrase about caring. Our website is Cross Church Cares. You see shirts that look in awesome Suns colors in the back that you can buy that says we care. But we say that for a reason, is we want to be a place in a church that is marked in our community by people who actually care about them, whether they love Jesus or not. And to think about it in this way is that if our church, us gathered in this building, one day just disappeared overnight, would anyone in this community care except for the people that attend here? Meaning, would they care when all of a sudden there's not a food pantry, when there's not a recovery ministry, when there's not people partnering with their schools to help our community, when there's not donations happening around the holidays to give to those in need? And those are the things we should be doing, and doing all the more so that if our church did not exist as a gathered people, our community would be like, hey, I don't agree with their beliefs, I don't agree with that Jesus, but man, they were good people who made our community a better place. And Peter's kind of saying here, he's like, hey, worry about your own stuff, start there, and kind of make sure you're right with God, and then start loving other people. And here's what he tells us the result will be. He says, then the result is they will glorify God. And they will glorify God on the day he visits. That could be a really bad thing. That could be the day he visits their personal life, or the day he visits at the end of time, and it's all going bad from there. But what he's saying is that they will glorify God, and what Peter is starting to seed in our mind at this time is the old phrase of kill them with kindness. Does our world stink at times? Is our world rough? Is our world full of sin? Do you look around and be hopeless when you listen to podcast after podcast about how dumb people are? Yes. But is this ultimately our home? No. And Peter at the start of this is saying, hey, yes, our world is bad, but this is not our home. Keep killing them with kindness. Keep loving them. Keep worrying about your own holy conduct, which leads into the next part, which just gets that much harder and that much worse, is Peter tells us that we are to submit to authority that God allows to be in place. Let's keep reading in verse 13. He says this, submit to every human authority. Hope you're already uncomfortable. It's, I don't know, you hear that, you're like, authority, submission, this isn't good. Because of the Lord, whether to the emperor as a supreme authority. If you need a history lesson, Emperor of Rome, never a good dude, always a bad dude, especially in their time where he's cutting people's heads off in their day right now. Whether to the emperor as a supreme authority, verse 14, or to governors as those sent out by him to punish those who do what is evil and to praise those who do what is good. Verse 15, for it is God's will that you silence the ignorance of foolish people by doing good. Think about this again in a little more depth, the context. Peter is writing this to refugee Jewish Christians living in Rome, meaning because they're Jewish, the Romans don't like them. Because they're Christians, the Jews don't like them, and they don't live in their homeland, so they're literally scrapping by, trying to live by whatever they can, and everyone in the government and in their culture around them hates them. And Peter just says, submit, submit. He not fight. He doesn't say fight them. He doesn't say protest. He doesn't say march. He doesn't say picket. He doesn't say post or share angry political rants on social media. He says submit. I don't know about you, but that's not an easy message to kind of bring to our hearts. I don't know about you, but I am American, okay? I was born here. I lived in Arizona my whole life. I was born an American citizen. I love America. And we, from early age, born into us is a country that was founded on rebelling from tyranny, okay? Give me liberty or give me death. I'm pretty sure I learned that in elementary school, okay? I don't know if they teach that anymore. That's a different story. But of all that, in our natural desire of wanting to rebel against any authority that is placed in our life, Peter keeps saying, submit. You see, we live in a day where you're either fighting for or you're fighting against things. We're making arguments for more freedoms or making arguments for more restrictions, whatever side you're on. For example, you have sides out in the world saying we need more freedom in such. We need more freedom when it comes to abortion rights. We need more freedom when it comes to gun rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on. Or you have, on the other side, you have things that are fighting for more restrictions for abortion rights, more restrictions for gun rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In our natural tendency in this world is we're in the middle in our country of this kind of runaway two-party system that asks us to pick a side and fight on that side, to sell out for one of those sides. But when Peter enters into this discussion, he doesn't say, he says like, hey, don't fall into that trap. He says, hey, don't become a political warrior. Don't fight this fight like they tell you to. Instead, he just says, submit to every human authority. I don't know about you, but we don't like this. I don't know about you, but our culture doesn't like this. Even our church at times doesn't like this, because if we're honest with ourselves, we want to say, no, Peter, we need to cancel the wrong authority. No, we need to vote down the wrong law. No, we need to burn the wrong thinking businesses, or we need to kind of excommunicate, or we need to silence the misinformation that I disagree with. But he just keeps saying the same word, submit. Now, some people will use the Bible to kind of counter this idea of submission to the government. And they'll point to a few different stories throughout the Bible. One of those is like the Egyptian midwives in the Old Testament. Is Pharaoh said, hey, kill all Jewish babies, and they didn't. Instead, they didn't do it at all. And they just said like, hey, we can't kill them. They're giving birth too soon and they're too strong. And they lied to Pharaoh and said it's not working. If you go a little bit farther, you get to Rahab the prostitute, who lied to the government in order to protect the spies of Israel. When you go into the New Testament, you see that the apostles wouldn't stop preaching Jesus, even though it was against the law at that time when they were being threatened to have their heads cut off, and they just did. But here's the difference. The difference in those stories is they weren't inciting violence and they weren't causing civil disruption. They were merely loving people, being faithful to God in a respectful manner to the government. And you see, essentially all this starts with us submitting to Jesus in the model he laid out. Think about this for a second. Jesus came to earth and he was not just a man, but he was fully man and fully God. At any moment, Jesus could have been like, I'm fed up with this. This government is ridiculous. These people are crazy. This religious system is broken. I'm going to call down some angels and I'm going to rain fire on all this stuff. But he didn't. Instead, Jesus submitted to a corrupt government, into a corrupt civil process. He was unfairly arrested, and it led all the way to him being crucified on a cross for a crime he never committed. You see, Peter learned this the hard way. When Jesus went to get arrested, Peter was with him. And Peter's first reaction was he pulled out a sword and he cut a dude's ear off. And then Jesus took that ear, healed it back on the guy's head and said, put your sword away. Peter's like, wait, what? I'm doing the right thing here, Jesus. I'm sticking up for you. I'm protecting you. And Jesus is like, no. You're learning a lesson. Just sit back and I'll teach you. And here, Peter keeps echoing his teachings of Jesus here. He's writing the same thing that Paul wrote in Romans 13, that the greatest apologetic of our day, the greatest counter to a corrupt government and an evil culture is submission and good works. We keep killing them with kindness. You see, the last way I think we pursue this holiness, and it impacts how we interact with people in politics, is ultimately we follow God as master above all else. Let's check out verse 16. And maybe you're hearing all this and you're like, yeah, I get it. This is what it's saying, but this is really difficult. Okay, like I get it. This isn't my home. I'm a stranger here. I just need to worry about myself. I need to kill them with kindness. I need to be respectful and submit to the government. But what about this? Well, Peter starts to address our apprehension. Verse 16, he says, submit as free people, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but as God's slaves. You see where gets so complicated is how far do we take this submission? How far do we follow the government if the laws of the land are against God's laws? Well, in verse 16, Peter gives us this answer. Because he says this, that even though you have been freed, even though you're not technically, ultimately a citizen of America, you have a greater citizenship in heaven than what we have here. But he's like, you're not completely free because you're a slave to God. And you're a slave to God's law. Meaning that if we are a slave to God's law, if there's examples where a human law tries to oversee God's law, we go with what God says. Let's look at an example for a second. If the government ordered us to commit genocide, does that mean we submit to their will? Absolutely not. Because it goes against God's law of murdering, of loving the people around us, and that would be a way where we drop in and say, hey, I'm not gonna submit to the authority anymore. This is too far. This is going against what God asked me for, and I have to draw a line. But this is where it gets tricky, because it's really black and white with murder, with sexual fidelity, with issues that are so black and white when you can look up a 10 commandment and you say, yep, don't follow that, I'm done. But it can easily become really gray and more social issues, with more health issues, when there's things like lockdowns and mandates. I know I say that, maybe you're like getting a little uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable, okay? I mean, think about this for a second. Looking back over how our society and our churches handled COVID, it's easy to see that no one was right in that situation. You look back and you're like, man, that was a disaster. No one had any idea what was doing. And the information, we had no idea what to believe. Everyone's going this way. We're doing that. We're closing. We're not closing. We're open. We shouldn't be open. We're defying the government. We shouldn't defy the government. Nobody has any idea what was going on. And this is where the hard work comes in, is that in order to find this line, in order to find the wisdom in here, it comes to us personally and corporately seeking God's word and prayer consistently to actually know what the heart of God is. And you're like, well, that's a cop-out. That's the church answer. Yeah, it's the right answer. That the only way we can walk this line is if first, personally, we look at ourselves and we say, do I know God's word? Am I praying to him? And I'm in communication to him? And you're like, well, I know a lot of crazy people that say that, but they don't act like it. Well, here's the next step of that. And then do you surround yourselves with other people who do the same thing? You know what that's called? Church. That's called being in community with other people who are doing the same thing as you. And I wish we could give out a pamphlet today to say, hey, this is when you obey the government, this is when you don't. That'd be super convenient. And you could probably Google something and find something close. I would just be a little scared of it, okay? But it takes wisdom, it takes discernment, it takes pursuing God's holiness for us to understand it. And here's the deal is, listen, sometimes we're gonna get it wrong. Sometimes the church at large might get it wrong, or we as individuals get it wrong, and that's where forgiveness and grace come in. But here's the deal, when other people get it wrong, that's also where forgiveness and grace come from us. And here, Peter is driving us here to tell us we need to be peacemakers. We need to be peacemakers as much as it's possible, as long as it doesn't mean we compromise the Bible and the gospel. He's telling them, don't incite violence when they really wanted to incite violence in Rome. He's like, don't make people angry when there was a lot of people, they probably were driving them crazy, that they wanted to drive crazy. He's like, don't be crazy. Don't argue with everyone. Instead, submit and do good works, and that will give you the room to speak Jesus into other people's lives. As we said at the beginning of all this, as citizens of heaven, we are held to a higher standard than citizens of America or of any other nation in our world. And here's kind of a practical way we can, I think, begin to apply this and help us remember this. And here's kind of another key thought for today, is that here's how Peter almost kind of sums this up. And it's this, that we can honor our politicians and we can love our neighbors with the boundary of fearing our God. Check out verse 17, how Peter wraps up this section. He says, honor everyone. love the brothers and sisters, fear God, honor the emperor. Peter uses this word here, honor, twice. And this idea of honor is actually very similar to this idea of submission. It's to treat people with respect, to honor those who maybe are above you in positions of authority. And he's saying respect them. And then he brings in this other word. He says, love your brothers, love the brethren. And we can extend this to love the people around us as Jesus has called to. But here's kind of the linchpin verse all this points down to, and really what grounds this passage. He says, fear God. You see, ultimately, without the fear of God, this is when this starts to fall apart. That when we fear God, we don't have to worry if we're on the right side of the aisle, the correct side of the aisle. We don't have to worry if we're riding the right political trend. We don't have to worry if we are on the right side of history. Because when we fear God, when we keep his commands, he promises that we're going to be on the right side of eternity. Here's our problem that so often we can fall into. That we are afraid of politicians. That we think if one side gets too much in power, oh, that's gonna mean impending doom. It's usually the side you don't agree with. We fear our culture. We say, man, if we keep going this direction, if we keep saying these things, if we keep doing these things, our world is just gonna be a hot mess and it's gonna end. We fear our friends and those around us, and we're afraid of being canceled and say, man, if I say the wrong thing, or if I don't say this, then I'm maybe gonna lose social influence. Maybe I'm gonna even lose my job. I'm gonna lose this. I'm gonna be in a hard space. But Peter just brings us back to this honest truth of, do we fear our God? You see, if you fear our God, all that stuff kind of falls by the wayside. Because he tells us that he died for our sins, that he gives us a new life, he gives us new citizenship, a new identity, that no matter what happens in our world, no matter who gets elected, no matter what new social media app that looks like it's the end of humanity is invented, that God is still in control, God is still sovereign, God is still powerful, and we can trust him knowing that he will take care of it all. Here's what I want to end with today. I want to give you a question to reflect on. We've been saying this whole time, be a peacemaker, kill them with kindness, just be a good citizen, love people, examine your own character. But there may come times in our society when push comes to shove where we are more afraid of those among us than we are of our own God. We are more afraid of being canceled by the society and the politics of the day than canceled by our own God and our Creator. And where push comes to shove, here's the question I want us to reflect on. I want us to spend time in prayer with this week and answer honestly. Are we more afraid of being canceled by our culture or by our Creator? Do we truly have a healthy fear of our God? Knowing he is in control, knowing he is greater than any obstacle we may face, greater than any obstacle our country and our world may face? Or are we more afraid of the day-to-day things that scare us, that worry us, that give us anxiety, that make us stress, and that make us make decisions that we know are not right? See, ultimately, when we are holy in our interactions with our culture, in our interactions with politics, it's submitting to God, submitting to the authorities, all while holding firm to the truth of the gospel.